Hello and welcome to a review of the GPD Win 2. I'm more of a Vita YouTuber and I don't usually take a look at things like this, but I'm more of a portable gamer than just a Vita gamer in my heart. I love portables. Being able to mash as much power as possible into a tiny space is something that just appeals to me on a base level, and I've owned tons of portable devices along those lines. Several PSPs and DSs, Game Boys, 2 netbooks, laptops, and I've even owned a Pandora at one point in my life, but unfortunately I'm an idiot and ended up breaking it. I've always been on the lookout for that perfect portable device, one with a lot of power, a lot of versatility, and a size small enough that it's not a huge pain in the neck to carry around. And when I saw the Win 2 on Kickstarter, after having followed the development of the Win 1, but not buying one due to its general lack of power and feeling of being more of a prototype than anything else, the Win 2 seemed an absolute shoo-in for the position of the best portable device I could get my hands on. I bought it at the early Indiegogo price, which was $600 US. You can probably find it at retail for around $100 more than that. And this review hasn't been biased by any outside sources. I paid for this myself. No one from GPD has talked to me, and that's basically the entire situation. This review is going to be split into 4 main sections, which I'll leave timestamps for in the video description, but you probably just want to watch the whole thing anyway. There'll be hardware, where I talk about how the actual feel of the device is and what I think of it. Software, where I talk about the act of using Windows on something you'd almost never see it on, at least on this size. Emulators, where I test every emulator that's worth the time testing. And PC games, where I tested a handful of games and talked about other games I've seen working on YouTube. So let's just go and hop right into it. There's a lot to go over with the Win 2. Its hardware can be talked about in depth just with numbers and stuff, but capability isn't best expressed by benchmarks, but by real-world testing. So I won't spend much time talking about the specs outside of this paragraph. It's a Core M3 7Y30 processor, dual-core, with integrated Intel HD 615 graphics, 8GB of RAM, 128GB SSD by default, but it's swappable because it's M2 2242, that's a lot of 2s. A micro SD slot that has more in it, 5GHz and 2.4GHz Wi-Fi, Bluetooth, front-facing speakers, a microphone, a 720p 6-inch screen that you can touch, a built-in fan that's really good at keeping it cool, enough ports on the back to help it out a bit, full keyboard sans numpad, a controller layout but you can't click the sticks, 3 shoulder buttons on each side, and a general weight of a bit heavier than a Vita. You've got plenty of options if you want to play on this thing. The hinge opens up to a decent viewing angle, but snaps into completely flat a little before my perfect viewing angle, but it's not too far off. You've got 2 analog sticks, which are legitimately really nice and feel a lot like the Vita's, just a little bit bigger, and they're very easy to be precise on. I'm simply not, because I'm a flailing retard most of the time. The D-pad is a bit more mushy than a Vita in a slightly uncomfortable position, so I'll probably only use it when required, but it's not unusable at all. Directions are pretty easy to tell apart, and I was able to do one of those fancy Zangief 360-degree throws in the Neo Geo Pocket Color game, so it's fine for that. The face buttons are clicky enough for feedback's sake, and your switch in the middle for swapping for controller mode and mouse mode is strong and easy to use. You have 3 sets of shoulder buttons on the back, and the buttons that are L1 and L3 and R1 and R3, which is like the L and the ZL and the R and the ZR buttons on the new 3DS, are both great, easy to feel and click really loudly. L2 and R2 are a bit harder to feel and press, and they don't have as loud a click, but it's still there, and it's definitely able to help you figure out how you're meant to press it. It's even got rumble, which caught me by surprise. The full keyboard is easy to type on and has lots of neat features to help out. Keys are easy to press down, and you'll know when they've been pressed 99% of the time. They make audible clicks. Accessible brightness and sound controls are also really nice. The power button is well out of the way and almost impossible to hit accidentally, not to mention that you have to hold it to get it to turn on normally. You won't be typing with this sitting on a desk, but it works great for typing with your thumbs while it's in your hands, and the more that you use it, the better you'll get at it. I can play text adventures on this thing without much issue at all. Just be warned that you'll want to see it as you're typing on it, since everything is slanted slightly down right to what you'll want to expect, at least in my experience. And since there's no backlight, it can be really hard to type on in the dark, so good luck if you do try. It's also heavy. Not massively heavy, but notably heavy, with a bit more weight than the Fat Vita, something I need to adapt to a little. Weight is balanced quite well across the entire body though, and next to no weight is in the screen part of it, so you only have to focus on balancing the body the way you want. Touching the touchscreen won't throw off your weight distribution either, which is a nice bonus. The feel of the entire case is pretty good, actually. It feels like a solid unit despite only being plastic. It feels surprisingly premium for a Chinese company that made this with $3 million from Indiegogo. The case is cleverly designed, typical hand placement won't block the fan, heat is dispersed pretty evenly so even high intensity games won't overheat your hands too much, and that fan is pretty damn good at keeping it all cool, but you will definitely start to hear it. You can drown it out using sound from the device itself, but it's still definitely there. Your speakers are front and center between the buttons and the keyboard, which is actually a really good placement for them, and they sound good. Not great, but good. Completely serviceable, but otherwise unremarkable. The major issue is with the popping sound that will happen on certain sounds, which can be fixed by installing a certain Realtek driver and not absolutely blasting the sound. Interesting fix. There is also a microphone. This is what the microphone on the GPD Win 2 sounds like. I haven't actually recorded anything on this yet and played it back, so this will be the first time I'm hearing how it actually sounds. All things considered, it sounds pretty good. The only downside is that the fan will definitely get in the way if it spins up at all. And to end it all off, we might as well talk about the screen, which is also pretty good. Not amazing, but it's nice and clear, it's pretty bright. It's about an in-between between the OLED Vita and the Slim Vita. However, it's not usable in direct sunlight thanks to the reflective glass. The 720p resolution isn't as much of a problem as you think because it's a 6-inch screen, and unless you really start putting the resolution down, you're not going to notice that little pixel density. You get both a 128GB SSD in the box, and you also have a micro SD card slot for more storage. I didn't actually use the included SSD as I almost immediately swapped it out for a larger capacity Transcend 256GB SSD, so I can't tell you how well the one in the box performs, but the fact that it's an M22242 SSD makes using Windows on this an actually really pleasant experience. 5-second power button to desktop times make it easy to just shut down and turn it on again when I need it. The micro SD is also fine too, with good read speeds overall. I had a 400GB micro SD in mine and was able to run some PC games without issues, so it'll be absolutely fine as secondary storage. I guess I gotta talk about the battery now, and despite how negative that might sound, it's actually great. Thanks to Intel Turbo Boost, which can downclock the processor when it's not being heavily used, lightweight tasks will probably get you a full 8 hours out of a full charge, and no, I'm not kidding, I got around that much. Obviously, intense games and high-end emulators are out of the question for that much battery life, especially if you want to push as much power as you possibly can out of it, but that's completely reasonable given the amount of power draw that would usually need. You can force the Win 2 to downclock the processor in order to get some extra battery life out of it, but we'll talk about that in a bit. A full charge from 0% battery with the Win 2 turned off is about 4 hours long. The power supply is 12-watt USB power delivery only, and if you don't have that, you won't be able to charge. So make sure you have either an international adapter or a power supply that can actually do that. I'm in Australia and I couldn't find an adapter to meet those specifications to save my life, so I had to use one of those international adapters. I have a couple of miscellaneous things to mention. You probably don't want to do something CPU intensive on full blast and put it down on a flat surface without coming up with a way for the fan slot to breathe. It can heat up really quickly if you do that. It's an odd problem, but considering where the air intake is, it's quite acceptable. My favorite solution was to put an external hard drive under it and then just rest it on top while hanging it off the edge a little bit to let the fan slot breathe. There is TV out via a micro HDMI port, but every time I try to use it, it cuts the bandwidth in half randomly, which causes everything to, put it mildly, fuck up. And while reinstalling drivers fixes the problem, it tends to come back the next time I reboot. Maybe newer drivers will fix this, or it might even be my devices used for recording causing a problem, I can't be sure. And don't be fooled by the fact you'll have 2 lights on the back, there's only one, but for whatever reason, the power LED light reflects off the inside of the headphone jack and makes it look like there's 2 lights on the back, and I'm not entirely sure why I felt that was worth putting in this review. So to sum up the hardware side of things, it feels like the $600 device I paid for it, not some stereotypical cheap Chinese knockoff. It's heavy, but it's solid, it's well designed, and generally it's a pleasure to use. Although the one thing that really stands out is the size. It's legitimately a bit smaller than I thought it was going to be, and my big hands are having a little trouble adjusting, admittedly. Here's a couple of shots of it next to a fat Vita for comparison. I definitely believe I'll be able to get used to this over time, and I'll be making the attempt. Just saying, it's going to be a little bit smaller than you might think. So time for the software side of things. So this thing runs a full fat, no concessions Windows 10 install, with all of the tricks you'd expect. Shitty store and start menu, check. Incredible variety of applications, check. Weird problems that can come out of nowhere or somehow be self-inflicted, you got it. All the weird shortcuts, unusual features, and just general functionality of a Windows machine on a portable platform, you're good to go. You get the general idea. You can also use Linux on this thing, but I'm not a Linux guy, so I didn't really try. However, sources do say that it should work mostly out of the box. You might need to install some gamepad and touchscreen drivers, but other than that, you'll be good. Generally, you'll be alright if you just want to stick with the GPD default Windows install, but if you're like me and you like your fresh Windows installs, be prepared for a bit of troubleshooting with odd drivers and software issues. Either way, you're still going to want to tell Cortana to shut up. So with your Windows 10 install will come all the software you would want on this thing, and all the software you could want on it will probably work. I've tried everything from LibreOffice to OBS to even a little bit of Cinebench, and it all went about as expected for a mobile processor like this. It all ran as expected, but not as well as you would hope as, say, on a workstation machine, and there was no noticeable stumbling of processor power. There is indeed a power limiter, but as I've said before, we'll get to that. I would fully recommend installing something like Launchy to help you keep track of your installed apps. That software is way more effective than the Windows Start menu on this thing. Windows itself doesn't seem to have much problem with the Win 2, but sometimes you'll need to change your screen orientation in the display settings menu. Your major way of navigating Windows 10 is via an absolutely genius feature called mouse mode. The switch in the middle of the Win flips between two modes. The left mode is the mouse mode, in which you use the right analog stick and the shoulder buttons to move and click. This is relatively slow until you learn the R2 button, bottom right shoulder button, speeds up your mouse, and with clever usage of this you can make it work to your advantage quite easily. With middle click being on L2 and left and right click being on the outer shoulders, it makes the Win 2 very usable in this mode, although it's obviously not faster than your typical desktop. However, with the screen being available for touch operation, a good combination of using the mouse for precision and the touch for quick actions makes it fast enough to not get in the way. It also comes with a bunch of other neat functionality that's really helpful for playing certain PC games. You have the left analog stick bound to the WASD keys in mouse mode, which is really useful for games that default to that. The face buttons default to the arrow keys, and the D-pad is much more interesting. It does mouse wheel movement. Great for moving up and down web pages as you read them, for example. The other buttons aren't so great though. Left and right on the D-pad aren't that much use due to the mouse wheel, and the inner shoulder upper buttons aren't any use at all since the right inner shoulder button binds to the down arrow, which is already taken up on the face buttons, and I have no idea why. The lower shoulder buttons can't be bound to anything either, since the R3 button doesn't map to anything except speeding the mouse up. Thankfully, 99% of these issues are nullified by swapping the mode to the controller mode, which makes every button a typical Xbox 360 gamepad, which works on most games. Any recent PC game, well-coded emulator, and other general applications that need one should work out of the box with it. I do miss the direct input option provided by the original Win though, despite never owning one, for old game purposes. The game controller mode is fine, but eventually you'll come across a PC game or two that just doesn't like it, and you'll probably want to pull out a generic profile on something like Joy-2-Key or Xpadder. But trust me when I say that if you go past 2005 PC games wise, you'll probably be fine. But I did end up buying this device for retro gaming, and old PC gaming is a part of that, so I should point out some things. The major thing is that the screen on the Win 2 is actually a portrait screen. It's wired that way, and it's mainly software trickery that makes it run in landscape. Most games in recent memory will be fine with this and scale to compensate without issue, but older games and software may well throw a fit, not rendering half the game unless you play in windowed mode. Some creative usage of a tool called DXWND is required for any Windows 9X error title you download from Good Old Games in my experience, although once you're used to it, it's not that hard to figure out how to make it all work. I should probably mention VMware as a solution tool, but I'm warning you now that mouse mode and touchscreen mouse are pretty much guaranteed to not work unless you 100% force these devices to go into the virtual machine. It does work, but you don't get fancy things like drag-drop file transfer or being able to just scroll your mouse into the machine. What I was able to test successfully was PCM, the more down and dirty PC emulation equivalent. Through a bit of tweaking and other such stuff, I managed to get this screenshot. It's the Battlezone demo running spec'd on a Pentium 90 with Voodoo Graphics 2 on Windows 98 at 100% speed. I did try emulating a Pentium 200, but it seemed to hang around 90% full speed, with a bit of dropping below that depending on what you're doing. Your mileage may vary. I'd probably recommend sticking with an XP virtual machine if you want to play games, say, beyond 98, 99 possibly. There is some other software that I'm happy to recommend. There is some software named VDX that can help your controller pretend to be a PS4 pad, which is perfect for making PS4 remote play work, and I managed to get it working rather well for being on 5 GHz Wi-Fi. You just need to plug the Win 2 into a monitor in order to get the 1080p screen that you'll need to install the remote play software. Using the Intel Extreme Tuning utility to change what power levels your Win 2 will get forcefully downclocked on is great if you're looking for max output on max battery, but it's something I don't recommend playing around with heavily if you don't know what you're doing. WinDirstat is great for keeping track of how much storage you've used, since there probably won't be too much for you to use on the Win 2, considering I'm pretty lucky that I have over 600 GB storage on mine. And I also keep a RAM disk around via MDisk. Basically means that I can move files off flash drives that are prone to overheating and keep them around in temporary storage until I reboot the computer, which is great for games that'll fit in the RAM disk without causing much trouble, like PS1 games. And as I keep feeling the need to mention, this is a full Windows 10 install, so any software you might work will probably just go right on and work, although the usability depends on what you're capable of making work with the weird setup. Overall, Windows 10 is quite usable on this machine. The combination of the two modes, mouse and controller, rebindable keys, and general capabilities of the Windows platform make this a very capable productivity machine depending on what you're looking for. I haven't gone into the ability of plugging it into a TV and then having a USB hub to make it all work like a desktop computer, since my TV out isn't actually working right now. But still, the versatility of this platform is excellent, and there are probably 100 different ways to use this that I haven't thought of yet. There are an absolute ton of emulators available for almost every platform ever made pre-PlayStation 3, so I'm not going to spend too much time going over the really simple ones. You can run the cycle-accurate emulators for pretty much anything before the 3D generations without issue for the most part. Mason for NES, Stella for the 2600, Hygan for the SNES, etc. So there's no point going into those specifically. Pretty much everything works that I could test, because remember, this is Windows 10, not something like the PSP where you need to specifically hunt for compatible emulators. And before anyone starts or asks for it in the comments, I hate RetroArch. I cannot stand it. Every time I boot it up, I run into another problem that their convoluted, controller-focused interface makes annoyingly hard to find. And if it ever crashes or errors at all, good luck figuring out why it did. I cannot, to save my life, figure out why anyone likes it or uses it in its current state. The only thing I've even considered using it for is Game Boy and DS emulation, because that shit is almost impossible to screw up. So I'll be using all standalone emulators for this one unless I specifically say so. All footage was recorded with either the built-in Windows DVR functionality, which is surprisingly good by the way, or through the TV out, which I used while it still worked. Getting into the generation I grew up with, we'll start with Nintendo 64, since it's the easiest to talk about. There's two main Nintendo emulators, MuPen 64 Plus and the variants of that, and Project 64, and I wanted to try both. Unfortunately, MuPen 64 absolutely refused to work. Every time I booted it up, it would crash. I even tried it in RetroArch. Crash. M64P, the variant of it that bundles it with an interface. Crash. M64PY, the Python interface. Instant crash. At least Project 64 didn't have the same issue, swapped out a newer graphics plugin and it worked absolutely fine. Performance with 2.3.2 is absolutely fine. Everything I tested worked great, at least the stuff I knew worked on my main PC. I probably could have afforded to turn up the internal rendering and it would have worked fine, so yeah, pretty much N64 is more or less perfect, at least in comparison to the PC side of things. Now, PlayStation 1 and Saturn are going to be in the same section, mainly because I'll be using the same emulator, Mednafen. The other options are rather questionable. Dr. Hell's Zebra is a great emulator, but in my experience is rather touchy, and EPSXE is rather old and less compatible at this point. On the Saturn side of things, SSF requires malware-riddled virtual drives, and Yabause, or Yabaus, or however you say it, has less compatibility overall. RetroArch actually causes a performance hit with these two emulator cores as well, so I use MedNaf and MedLaunch, whichever one decides to work first, and just play them from there. Performance is great on both cores, with both managing to maintain 60 FPS regularly on the handful of games I had time to try. That's all there is to say, it more or less worked pretty much out of the box. There was a drop here and there, not much on certain things, but overall the Win 2 is keeping pace nicely. While this wouldn't be a surprise if I was using an older, less compatible emulator, this need to keep up with the more accurate and modern options sticks to my tastes really well. Good job, Win 2. This is where things get really interesting. We're going to talk about the last handheld generation, the PSP and the DS. We've got some footage here, not much because my knowledge of these libraries has weakened over time, but we can make it work. Conveniently, a new version of PPSSPP came out around the time I was recording footage for this review, with a massive performance increase, so I'm working on that version with the background footage. And my test games all work splendidly with their internal rendering resolution around the size of the full screen. Even God of War, Chains of Olympus only had minor drops in the intro sequence, a sequence known to destroy lower-end devices, and I was running it at practically 3 times the regular resolution. I'm just really looking forward to when they finally get Outrun 2006 working properly in PPSSPP. I was actually playing Pursuit Force Extreme Justice on this before this update showed up, and it wasn't working 100%, like 90% most of the time, but when the new update came, it went straight up to 100%, so yeah. Great performance all around on PSP. The DS is way more interesting, mainly due to the addition of the touchscreen. A good setup with this could make a purely touchscreen game playable really easily, or at the very least, be a lot more playable than most handheld devices that aren't DSs or mobile phones. However, the only reasonable solution I can come up with is Android emulation with Drastic installed, because DES-MUME and RetroArch with the same emulator can't translate single touches to touchscreen input, with the DES-MUME standalone only recognizing double taps as single taps, and I don't know why. It took a little while to get an Android emulator that hasn't stolen my data once before on there, but the one I did pick, Memu, gave simple key-to-touch mapping, a shared folder with my DS ROMs on my computer itself, and via XPadder it should be alright for playing pretty much any DS game I want, since most people actually recommend using this setup to play DS emulation instead of an actual PC-based emulator. What a world we live in. Also, just while I'm here, PUBG Mobile does work on this, but the key binding is just impossible, so I didn't bother trying. And before I get on to the big 2, I just want to mention that I didn't get the opportunity to do extensive testing with D-Emule for Dreamcast, but I did pop it open for a quick game of Bang.io and a little bit of Blue Stinger, and both of them worked alright. There were a couple of performance drops here and there, but a little bit of tweaking helped that right out. And now we draw to the 2 big ones. I said that one of my big points for this sort of device was enough power, and power enough to run PlayStation 2 and GameCube emulation is something they've actually been advertising with this thing. If they can run at full speed portably, I'd be willing to forgive a lot of faults. The only emulators available here have been used, Dolphin and PCSX2, and I'm using their development builds, which is what most people recommend. I'll tell you roughly the settings I was using for both emulators when they come up. So, Dolphin. Holy crap, this actually works. There's drops here and there, a fair bit of which you'll see on the footage I have of Time Splitters, but the fact that this device, which I can carry in my pocket and run off its own battery pack, can run a full race of F-Zero end-to-end without dropping from 60 is just incredible. I played through the entirety of that Smash Melee game, and not one drop, with 4 people on one of the most visually intense stages in the game, at least in my memory. And Time Splitters, which seems to suffer from the same big open area GPU stress problem that a lot of games on this thing sometimes have, still holds up well enough even with those drops. Settings used weren't too far from the defaults, although I did keep it on native resolution. PCSX2 is a little different, but not too far from Dolphin. Known for being a lot less polished than Dolphin, it also runs a little bit worse. So it's recommended that you stick a few speed hacks on, which I've done, and it actually works too. Sure, there's more slowdowns, and you recommended to run the European game versions just to make sure that you can get the maximum performance you need on the more complicated stuff. But I'll say it now, since with a few more updates and possibly some tweaks I might not know about yet, it might improve the situation. Do you want a portable PS2 or GameCube right now? Get one of these things. This actually works. It's not 100%, but it works. I can actually play the PlayStation 2 version of Ratchet & Clank 3 at an acceptable frame rate on the go, at least compared to the Vita version. As for the settings on this one, I had all of the speed hacks on to some degree. After setting the PCSX2 preset to 4, it probably won't work for everything, but it seems to be a good compromise. I also rendered the scene at 480 by 360 on the graphics plugin, just to keep it at a decent speed while also being relatively close to native. And there are a couple of other emulators that I haven't tried just out of lack of personal interest, but by putting the Win 2's power consumption up as high as it goes, people have gotten PS3 download games like Scott Pilgrim vs. the World working, and see Emu running Wii U games like New Super Mario Bros. And even Breath of the Wild, although the frame rate is not promising. The fact that these even work on a device like the Win 2 at all, though, is something I've just been having trouble getting my head around, though. So, yeah, emulators, top-notch compatibility almost across the board. If there's anything before the 360 you want to play on it, it should work absolutely fine, or at least put in a really valiant effort. And so we move on to PC games proper, and of course the variety of how they work will vary depending on what game it is. I do apologise for not having actual footage of these running on the Win 2, but with how well most of them performed, you could probably look up any gameplay footage on YouTube and get a similar result. I want to start out with an example or two that points out that this thing is not godlike, and that some games will simply not run properly on it for one reason or another before I get back to what is basically endless praise at this point. I tried to play Binary Domain, but its configurator window is so big at 720p that you can't see the save and quit button, and you need to use that game's button to play the game, so thanks guys. Cities Skylines was a bust, in part due to my game crashing every time I tried to change the settings. It looks like it had saved my old settings from when I used to play the game on my big PC, and had a ton of trouble letting me change them, along with a bunch of old mods that loaded up the game every time started and caused trouble of their own, so good luck with that. Dark Souls, and I mean the regular Dark Souls, not remastered, had to get down to 320 by 200 resolution before the frame rate even approached playable, and even then big rooms would be enough to make it choke, so I was basically getting Blighttown style frame rates in the Duke's archive, so I'm basically going to call it unplayable at this point. So yeah, you need to be on your toes for what will and won't work. What will work though? Cuphead, solid 60 frames on the first couple of levels, very playable. Darius Burst ran great. Since the controls are rebindable, it was actually really easy to get this working the way I wanted it to. Devil May Cry 3 is part of the Devil May Cry HD collection. The resolution started at 1080p for some reason, I assume because I played it on my desktop, but once I pushed it down to 720p, it runs great. Doom and Duke Nukem both worked great with their source ports, Xandronum and eDuke 32, although I did have to use Xpadder for the controls. Brutal Doom is pretty good on a controller when you don't suck. Fire Pro Wrestling World. I managed to get through an 8-man battle royale with no frame rate issues whatsoever, with nothing but Steam Workshop characters, so yeah, that's absolutely fine. Free Space 2 worked fine with the open source project, but the complex control scheme and lack of native controller support makes a bit of a jerk to rebind. Hand of Fate 2. It has a reasonable amount of settings, and I could get it to work at 640 by 400 at around 60 FPS, so it's actually pretty good to play on this thing. Metro 2033 Redux. Well-optimized port. Doesn't run at much higher than 30 on the Win 2, but it's perfectly reasonable to play with that in mind. One Finger Death Punch. Even on the mouse mode, the mouse buttons are set up perfectly to just jump right in, and I had some good fun with this. Resident Evil 4 HD. When I limited the frame rate to 30 FPS before I went into the game and turned down the graphics settings, rock solid. 60 frames per second just doesn't work, unfortunately. It's too much for the poor thing. Robot Roller Derby Disco Dodgeball. Worked fine after I dropped the settings low enough. The controls are a bit hard on this one though, so be prepared to remap them. Slay the Spire works absolutely fine, and you can play with the touchscreen. It's just a little bit odd playing it that way though, and they don't have controller support in yet, but they are adding it. Stalker, Shadow of Chernobyl. Low details made it run pretty acceptably. Still hard as nails though, I didn't get much further than the first quest. Styx, Shards of Darkness. The settings in this game are ridiculous, with the game running at 320 by 200 if you want. I put it a little bit higher than that and got a pretty solid 30 frames a second with some VSync. More than good enough to play it. Vanquish didn't run that great. It ran at about 25 frames per second in the first couple of stages, which made it surprisingly hard to live through it. So, you know, I'm not going to call it unplayable, but you could probably do it if you're really motivated to. VR chat, yeah, I know, someone asked me to give it a shot. It ran like crap, but I'm not surprised. It's probably playable considering it's just a chat app. And the last game I tested, You Must Build a Boat, detected the touchscreen and ran exactly as it expected, as if you've played it on a mobile phone. Good job, devs. And that's just the stuff I've had time to put into this thing, thanks to the fact that a few prototypes popped up around the internet months before even the Indiegogo started. Tons of videos are available showing off games that do work, and a game is more likely to work on it than not given enough time to tweak it. Skyrim, Fallout 4, Overwatch, Doom, Grand Theft Auto 5, Tekken 7, World of Warcraft, Neo, Hollow Knight, A Hat in Time, Divinity Original Sin 2, Pillars of Eternity. The list just keeps going on and on and on. The sheer amount of PC games that you can play on the Win 2 is absolutely incredible for a size, and this isn't even counting in stuff like Steam in-home streaming, Moonlight, Xbox streaming, or PS4 remote play, all of which that I was able to test worked great thanks to the 5 GHz Wi-Fi. The amount of games you can play on this thing is just absolutely ridiculous. It's probably only limited by your storage space. So overall, the Win 2 is a legitimately incredible device for what it is. I wasn't expecting to be so blown away by it when it came in. I thought it was going to have something go majorly wrong with it out of the box, or that something would just lower the performance to something that was a little bit more within expectations. But it's actually exactly what was advertised, both by the Indiegogo campaign, well, in some places, and by the people who got prototypes on YouTube. It's small enough to fit in my relatively large but still reasonable pockets. It's powerful enough to handle 6th generation emulation. It's got Windows and Linux, so its versatility is almost infinite in that technological space. And the overall quality of the product matches devices I pay for from tech giants. There are minor things like the screen being wired to portrait, the HDMI out not working right, although that one might be my fault, and a bunch of minor things that will probably creep up on me over time. But the fact that this thing exists is still an absolute wonder to me, and I look forward to using it as my main gaming device for stuff that I can't get on my Vita. If you're into portable gaming and you want a one-size-fits-almost-all device, this is the absolute best place to look. I highly recommend it if you're willing to put down the $700 US for one. This has been Blue Maxima, and I will see you all next time.